May, June. But the one thing I wanted to highlight today, just as by way of introduction, was the dramatic difference in the levels of confidence that people had in the willingness to invest. So to what extent do you agree that the coronavirus will reduce government's willingness to invest in higher education over the next 5 years? In America, quite serious concern, 44% of leaders thought there would be a reduction. The economic damage, of course, will limit the ability to invest, let alone the wider climate. And a similarly worrying proportion in the United Kingdom, almost a third of institutions. And that compared dramatically to China, where there's much higher confidence. Similarly, you have highly marketized systems. So in China, no one's expecting anybody to go bankrupt as a result of the crisis. It's a very state-run system. In America, there is genuine concern that universities will go bust. They will fail economically as a result of the crisis. And just a final word from me, just to set that bigger picture, that we asked the survey respondents lots of free range questions. And the one I'd highlight is just one East Asian president that I think the shift from West to East in leadership in the world will likely accelerate. And we may even see actually some improvement for the global South. So that's it. I just wanted to share a couple of slides to say this is a big picture issue. I'll stop sharing my screen. The point I just wanted to stress is that there is this geopolitical shift. I think the marketized Western systems will be hurt more. The Western economies, I think, will suffer more because of the way they've handled the pandemic, certainly the United States, certainly the United Kingdom, very, very worrying handling, very serious longer-term economic consequences. In stark contrast, these East Asian universities already rising will, I think, have a greater share of international talent and more resources to invest in research excellence. So I think the pandemic will really hasten this shifting balance in the geopolitical knowledge economy. And I think it raises some very interesting questions for universities across the world to rethink their partnerships and rebalance their relationships. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Phil. That's a very interesting point that you are summarizing and showing here, this geopolitical change of direction and shift, between West and East, to which the pandemic might add or might, support and accelerate in a way or another. Before going to see the advice or to seek more information from our second panelist, let us see what our attendees think about the following. We have a small poll to run. And the question is as following. Do you think the pandemic will change your institution's internationalization strategies in a lasting way? Yes or no? So Elena, if we can run the poll and see what will be the answer from our colleagues. Maybe we'll allow 1 minute for our colleagues to vote, and then we close the poll and we see the result. The pandemic has absolutely impacts in various aspects of our economy, our education, our international relations, and the balance of choosing maybe even a partner. So what is the position of your institution? Is that impacting on that direction or not? Maybe let us see the result. So as expected, more than 80% of the attendees believe that, yeah, the pandemic has an impact and it is more or less changing, the institution internationalization strategy in a lasting way. So more than 80% confirming the same. And continuing with the same direction, I would like to hear from Ms. Aisha, if you can highlight on a term of consequences of the pandemic in short and long term, on students and academic mobility, globally and regionally, what will be maybe the major changes and what will be the impact in short term and the long term that we should expect and that we should see shifting in the higher education arena?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, first of all. Let me just say, as a practitioner of international, programs and international education, let me say that, I will sort of talk about two different kinds of student mobility, because in terms of, problems, challenges versus opportunities, the picture is, I think, a little different. In terms of credit mobility, and by that I mean students going to a partner university abroad, to broaden their horizons, to earn some credits, to gain some important skills on study abroad programs. There's a certain kind of picture and lots of new opportunities I'll talk about, and I think my colleague will refer to them as well. And then there's the issue of degree mobility. So students enrolled in a foreign university for a whole degree, and the consequences there, what Phil was referring to in a very sort of global perspective, are sort of more dire. So let me start by the credit mobility or study abroad programs or exchange programs. In Turkey, when the pandemic hit, this was mid-March, and the Council of Higher Education immediately suspended, exchange programs, all international mobilities. It wasn't even up to us. It was sort of a national decision. And initially, of course, as a practitioner, your concern is always with the safety of the students. So the short-term impact was definitely for all of us international educators, reaching out to our students, briefing them about canceled courses, moving to online education, changing exam schedules, and of course, travel restrictions, quarantine measures, etc. Most of this information was constantly changing. Almost all of it was beyond our control. So it was very, very stressful initially. But, in just a few weeks in Turkey, as well as in many other countries, the universities pivoted to online education. And sort of the dust settled. Most of our incoming, let's say, exchange students left. Most of our outgoing students came back home, and everybody settled, in front of their computers for online teaching and learning. And as international educators, we started organizing a lot of webinars. We invited a lot of guest lecturers from our partner universities abroad. So we were bringing, the world to the classrooms, the online classrooms of our students in a very short period of time. And, I think this was the silver lining. We realized, I think, throughout the spring semester that international education has not stopped. We were able to deliver our promise of providing sort of global learning opportunities, in fact, for more of our students, not just the small minority who were able to go on physical exchange programs and study abroad programs, but all of those students sitting in front of their computers, having access to different academic cultures, very distinguished sort of academics lecturing them from partner institutions. So this was like really, we realized quickly that we had an opportunity here, but in terms of the degree mobility, things were quite difficult because we soon realized that many of our sort of full-time degree-seeking students have left. We're not exactly sure how many of them will be returning in the fall semester. And in terms of the fall term, student recruitment, the numbers are down. All over the world. I mean, in Turkey and in my university as well, we have a huge population of international degree-seeking students, and we've been struggling with this, obviously. So this is, pre-pandemic degree-seeking mobility is about 7.5 million students. It's a huge business. Phil sort of touched upon this. This is a huge source of revenue for the destination countries. And for individual institutions, especially who rely on specific sending countries such as China, it's even sort of like Australia, for example, it's very, very difficult for them. And I don't want to monetize everything. It's also the dreams and aspirations of 7.5 million students and their parents, who want to make sure that their children have access to a good education and a good future sort of career. So there, I mean, the expectation, I think the sort of midterm expectation is that the numbers will decline, and it will probably take 3 to 5 years before they can go back to the pre-pandemic levels. So that means the universities have to think about their funding streams in a different way, diversify that. Think about campus investment in a different way rather than brick and mortar invest in online education, for example. So there's a huge, consequence in terms of especially degree-seeking students and their mobility. But in terms of our sort of colleagues who are interested more in partnerships, providing global learning opportunities to our students to give them the global competences and the global citizenship, there we have new opportunities, which I must say we had before, but we didn't invest in them, or we didn't sort of practice them as much as we should, we now realize. Most of these trends, such as virtual exchanges or COIL, they existed before, and we talked about internationalization at home or internationalization of curriculum before in the last 10 years. These are not new topics, but it took for the pandemic to bring them to the forefront, from the fringes to the forefront of our discussions in international education. I may want to stop there because I know Professor Urube will probably talk about those sort of innovative international programming, these different approaches, the virtual sort of opportunities for global learning more. So I'll come back to some of these things in the second round, maybe.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting picture you are drawing here when we are seeing a kind of contrast from a short-time impact when it leads to realizing that, in fact, the ultimate goal of the internationalization of education is there and is even assumed or achieved in a better way, with this global aspect and all that call for attention, that you are drawing. It's very interesting. And from the other side, a more problematic situation when there are financial impact on the degree and the mobility itself and on the hiring, which might push on a long term the university to diversify and to look for alternative to that. I'm just trying to summarize those conclusions because this is the very important point we want to get from this panel discussion. So let us move on. My next question would be for our panel member, Mr. Giorgio Marioni. But before that, we would like to seek the input from our attendees because it's really an interaction we are having here. The question is, which of the following effects had the pandemic and its consequences on international research at your institution? Because internationalization is not only on the mobility, and you can see here 5 choices. Your institution is not involved in international research. The pandemic decreased your engagement in international research. The pandemic did not affect your engagement in the international research. The pandemic, in a way or another, increased your engagement in international research, but it becomes more competitive because everyone is online today and equal opportunities. Or the pandemic increased your engagement in international research and it becomes more collaborative. So we're gonna give a minute or two maximum to our attendees to give us their point of view from the perspective of their various institutions from around the world. Okay, the answers here is more or less distributed, but we can see 2 equal answers when the pandemic decreased the engagement in international research, and the opposite, the pandemic increased the engagement in international research, which is 32%. And this is very interesting to see and to analyze that. So let's say for 30%, it was a negative impact, for 30%, it was a positive impact, and almost 10% is distributed between choice number 1 and choice number 2, and 20% believe that the pandemic did not really impact their engagement in research. Thank you very much for this. Giorgio, from your perspective, and I know that you are looking to a lot of aspects in your association, and you run also a lot of surveys and you look to the scientific research and cooperation across the sector. If you look to the COVID-19 impact on scientific research from your perspective, what you can tell us about it?
Thank you very much, Professor Nabil, and thank you very much for the participant to replying to the survey, the small survey, the questionnaire. And in fact, what I'm telling you today, it's a bit in line with what you just replied. So I was asked to tell you a little bit more on the impact of COVID-19 on scientific research and collaboration and international collaboration. So as mentioned before, the International Association of Universities during the time of the pandemic ran a survey, a very quick survey of 3 weeks for all higher education institutions around the world to understand what was the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And among the questions we asked in the survey, there was also a question on research and how the pandemic affected research. And as we can see from the results, 80% of the institutions were impacted, and this we can see also from your replies. There were very few institutions that said that the pandemic didn't have any impact. And at the same time, the effect was a mixed one. So at the beginning, we could see especially a negative effect on some basic feature of international collaboration in research. Very simple ones. Scientific research were canceled, like at 80% of institutions, scientific research have been canceled. International travel has been canceled. So visiting professor, exchange of researchers was complicated. And even research projects were delayed or even at risk to be completed. At half of the respondents to our survey, they expressed this concern for the completion of international project in research. And we even had 20% of respondents that they said that completely scientific research had stopped. And as we saw even today in the small question we asked, there are some of you who said that the pandemic had a very negative effect on research at your institution. However, at the same time, there were institutions that they said that the pandemic had a positive effect on their research and on their international research. And this we saw it also in our survey on a different question on the effect of the pandemic on international partnership. And here we can see a split almost half and a half between higher education institutions, which said that the pandemic had an effect of decreasing the international partnership, and an effect of half of the institution that has a positive effect. The positive effect can be divided in two. One is increase of existing collaboration, and the second one, which is, in my opinion, even more interesting, it's the creation of new opportunities for new partnership. So some of you also replied, it created new opportunity for research and more collaborative research because of new opportunities. If you want, also, we heard before a kind of playing level on new opportunities for collaboration through online tools. But at the same level, one thing that we saw happening in the world and Phil also introduced it a bit with the idea of a shift from west to east, I would generalize it in the sense that there are really substantial regional differences in terms of research and research collaboration. And in our survey, for instance, we have a very striking point. In Africa, 73% of institutions replied that the effect on international partnership was negative. So their partnership were weakened. Whereas in Asia and Pacific, almost a little bit less than half, about 44% of institutions replied that the pandemic was an opportunity to increase and to open up new opportunities of collaboration. So what does this imply? This implies a risk of inequality, and actually we already know that there is inequality out there in scientific research, but the pandemic is bringing in the risk of increasing this inequality between countries, but also among higher education institutions inside the same country. So we have to think about this. But at the same time, we have this risk of inequality. But as I mentioned before, and I would like to end this intervention on a positive note, the pandemic is bringing up new opportunities to create new type of collaboration, to invest more in research, and also is bringing a recognition of scientific research, which was somehow threatened before by a movement of discrediting expert and scientific knowledge. But maybe I will tell you more about this in my second intervention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. So the impact of the pandemic on the research is more or less mitigated between positive and negative aspects with the introduction of a risk of inequality. But in overall, you look to it more as bringing more opportunities and pushing in the positive side for the research in an international level. We're going to continue on seeing the impact of the pandemic. And I would like to ask Professor Ainhoa on the actionable strategies and alternative and variation of model and innovation that you have been, implementing in order, to recognize and to have planned for future internationalization and mobility, considering the pandemic. And you as innovator in this area, we would really love to hear your input in that regard, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Nabila. Thank you very much to CLIX for this invitation to take part in this panel in order to share some of the lessons that we have learned of the impact of COVID-19. In fact, to talk about these actionable strategies in a very short time, it's a challenge, but I will try to provide you with a snapshot of some alternative models of innovation that may help you plan for the future. And I will start with a personal story about my institution, which was not a very international one, but we did a great shift in a very short time. In July 2019, so it was a very, it was a few time ago, my institution, São Paulo University, decided that it was necessary to change the strategy of internationalization, and the traditional Vice-Rectorate for Internationalization turned to be named Vice-Rectorate for Internationalization and Digital Transformation. And this was our first step towards an institutional change of mind, because it was a complete change of mind that made it possible to face COVID-19 when it appeared in our lives, which was something that we didn't expect to. Our strategy was based on two pillars. The first one was internationalization abroad, which was a traditional strategy of mobilities, alliances of dual degrees, study abroad programs, and so on. But the second pillar was new, and it was internationalization at home. And it meant that it was a new objective that tried to provide international experiences to the university community, to both students, professors, and staff without traveling abroad. It was an online experience, but not merely based on technology. It should be a real and different process of learning, and this was the great challenge. For doing this, we defined a new concept that was called our global classroom. It was our THEO global classroom. And it meant that our process of teaching and learning should be global. It should be international, it should be multicultural, but without traveling. Why? Because less than 10% of our community was engaged in an international experience, and we had a very low percentage of foreign students. So we decided that we had to change our mind, to think out of the box, and to design something different. Our model of inspiration was Florida International University. That was one of the leading institutions in the field of globally networked learning. And we went to Florida to visit the university, and we stayed there, to know exactly what they were doing. So we started to work on a limited number of pilot projects and to look for partners for a strategic alliance in order to create a European online campus, to develop online projects, online mobilities, joint online degrees, online hubs, microcredits, among others. And when we were working on this, in March 2020, then Spain turned into the forefront of countries, facing COVID-19 with very, very bad rates, as you know. So it was a coincidence, and we took advantage of it. For us, it was a great opportunity. For my vice rector, it was, like going to the moon, because the university decided to invest massively on technologies and to develop what we call a high flex system, which is not only a dual model system, enabling students both to attend lectures on campus or to be online. It means that our students, if they're at home, they can choose in one click if they want to simulate that they are sitting on the fourth row, or they can choose a different view to see how those physically present as questions, or they can come face to face with the lecturer and interact with him or her as if he or she, were physically in the room. So those technologies help us to design an atmosphere, a different, like a different classroom in which everyone was integrated, no matter if they were on site or if they were online. So in this case, all THEO classrooms had this high flex system, and they have it right now. So now we are not working on pilot projects or pilot groups. We're working, as if all the groups could do this. What do we do? And which are, the type of actionable strategies that I would like to talk about? Well, some of them probably you're familiar to them, but in other cases, there are some new ideas that I would like to share with you. The ones that are very traditional are, for instance, the idea of organizing online international weeks, to encourage the participation of all individuals, institutions interested to change activities and this know-how. This is a very traditional one. The other one could be invite guest professors, for instance, to give an online lecture. But we were thinking about other type of new strategies. So we were looking for new international partners in order to develop new activities. What for? Basically to personalize the curriculum of our students in order to allow them, for instance, to study online modules developed by partners so that our students get a certificate or a diploma from other universities. It is different to an online mobility, because in an online mobility, it means to study the full semester and to follow, a course. In this case, we're talking about linking these modules to extra academic outcomes, or even following part of a course. It's like giving micro credits or micro diplomas to our students that get online a certificate, that is going to certify that they have some skills. This is one option. The other one, for instance, is organizing what we call mirror lectures, in the sense that during the semester, students from 2 countries and 2 universities that are enrolled in a very similar course or subject, thanks to technology, they follow the class of the other university's professor and vice versa. Okay, so we organize the schedule so that we know which sessions are going to be served. And thirdly, last but not the least, which is the real project in which we really want to work on, is what we call COIL, the Collaborative Online International Learning Project. And my university is deeply focused on it. And what is a COIL? Well, COIL is an acronym, of this Collaborative Online International Learning Method that is implemented by many international universities. It involves a virtual way of teaching, which is different. In this case, what you need are 2 teachers, 2 cohorts of students, 2 institutions that want to cooperate, and 1 unit or module that you are going to serve. But you share it in a different way, because it's a collaborative project in which students do work in an international teams and professors are facilitators. Okay, so it's not a mirror lecture. Professors facilitate, supervise this learning process, but the COIL modules are based on learning, learning in the sense that the students are building this learning process. So the COIL modules develop common virtual projects. They integrate into a syllabus. They may last from 4 to 8 weeks. It doesn't matter if this is synchronous or asynchronous online process of collaboration. But what is very important is that it's assessing both product and process. Since it's content-driven, as both partners have to define learning activities in order to achieve learning outcomes, and it's also based on an international learning team. So it is simply great, in terms of developing intercultural competences, teamwork abilities, professional skills, and students do really enjoy this type of activities. So I hope that these ideas, are useful for you. But for us, COVID-19 has been a great opportunity, and it has helped us to convince, the government management body of the university that investing, in this type of activities is very important, because it's going to open us to new markets. This is more or less the idea that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, that new form of internationalization and of bringing, the international experience to home, of course, through the use of or rely on heavily the technology, but new model like the experience you are mentioning too. When we think about the degree differently, we used to hear about dual degree and joint degree and, transferable, but this is something totally new when we are collaborating together on the same content, sharing the knowledge, the way of teaching it, and the contributing it. Maybe that's one of the very actionable strategy that will shape the internationalization in the future. Thank you very much. Before going to our next question, we would like to hear again from our attendees. I know some of the questions are coming, and our panel member thankfully are replying to some of them on the chat. We will see if the time allows, we will publicly ask some of them. But before going with the question to Ms. Aisha, I would like the attendees to answer the following very simple question. With all what we have been saying now, on the new way of going with internationalization, impact on the degrees, impact on the research, do you think that international education in general, post-pandemic, will look very different than the one pre-pandemic? A very simple answer, yes or no. So 1 minute maybe to our attendees to tell us what they think, and then we will see the confirmation of the trends with Ms. Aisha. I think we might close the poll and see the results if our attendees. So almost 90% absolutely said, yeah, the post-pandemic on international education is not the same as the pre-pandemic. And here I'll again address the same question to Ms. Aisha. What do you think about that? What will be in the post-pandemic, and what kind of strategies for future internationalization we're gonna have to follow? Do we need really to reimagine the whole international education, or there are some components that will remain the same with maybe more or less a different reshape of it, please?
I think, yes, we have a chance to reimagine international education. Some things will remain, but I think there will be significant changes. And let me sort of, again, talk about a couple of different aspects of this. I think we will need to reimagine international education beyond physical mobility. We've been focusing on mobility for a very long time. This is the bread and butter of international education, but not just for the international office staff. This has been the case for the rectorates, for the program accreditors, for the rankings bodies. For example, if Phil will agree with me on this, if a ranking body or institution comes and looks at your program or your university on internationalization, the first criteria or the first measurable thing that they look at is mobilities. We have to move beyond this as both practitioners at the international office, senior academic managers, and all the other stakeholders in the higher education sector. Because we know, I sort of stressed this before, mobilities are only available for a lucky few of our students. Instead, we have to give these global competences to all our students. That should be our aim. So I think from now on, the things that we will underline, the concepts will be access and equity, providing more of our students the opportunities to develop these global competences. But I saw one comment in the chat box as well, having sort of online or virtual exchanges or programs for internationalization, of course, doesn't make it all equal for everyone. There is still a digital gap that we have to address. We have to make sure that in certain regions or countries or in certain universities or a certain group of students, whether with less economic, means or disabilities, we have to make sure that with the, online education and online modes of internationalization, we have to keep in mind the digital divide, and we have to provide access to all of our students. Again, that should be our aim. The second concept sort of I want to emphasize is sustainability. Again, there was talk before the pandemic that we have to consider the carbon footprint of international education, which is quite high, in fact. It's not just student mobility, but staff mobility, all the international sort of academic conferences that thousands of people travel to. I mean, some of it I think was becoming really redundant and more of an academic tourism before the pandemic. And I think the pandemic and the environmental impact of the quarantine measures, that we realized that we were all able to enjoy better air quality, for example. All these things made us really rethink our carbon footprint as international education community. And we have to make sure that in the future that we really take responsibility and plan accordingly and responsibly, so that we have new models where now we know we don't have to travel for everything, right? We can do some of these things that we do remotely. From, moving on, I think after the pandemic, I see a couple of, trends. I see sort of a trend in blended global learning. So I think most of the study abroad programs will be shorter, and they will have to be combined with some sort of, course integration or curriculum integration before students travel or after they do. But there is going to be, I think, more sort of intentional, programming for study abroad, not just, put students on a plane and send them abroad for 2 weeks, but really integrated to subject courses and curriculum. So there has to be sort of this innovative international programming that Professor Urube was talking about. Those were great examples. Again, I would expect to see more internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum, engaging the faculty more, moving internationalization beyond the international office, really disseminating to the whole university, integrated into the academic culture of the university. So these were, again, all things that we talked about in international education conferences before the pandemic, but now there's our chance to really get down to business and get these things done. Now, in terms of degree mobility, in terms of this internationally mobile students for their degree studies, I totally agree with Phil that there was this trend before the pandemic, of major changes or shifts taking place in the knowledge economy, and these will be, I think, quickened. I see, for example, a trend in regionalization, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. But in other regions too, in Africa too, you will see more students looking to get their, university degrees in a university closer to their home country. And, the increasing of, quality in many countries now, the diversification that Phil was talking about, now there's that option. And I think the dominance of USA, UK, and overall the English-speaking countries will be less. And I think countries which are perceived to be safer and more affordable will become sort of important destination countries. Again, if we look at, the impact of COVID immediately, all the travel restrictions, public health concerns, the rise of a populist discourse, even racist discourse in some countries, it's not going to be easy for many of those big destination countries to attract those students anymore. And the students feel that they've been sort of treated as maybe cash cows for too long in the past, and that it's not going to be that easy anymore to attract those students. And there is a looming sort of economic, well, I don't want to say recession, but some sort of shrinkage anyway in the sending countries. So I think students will be on the lookout for those countries and universities that really give good value for the money. So again, that's one of my sort of predictions, if you like. And I also see a return to an emphasis on TNE, transnational education, but not in the way that it was done maybe 20 years ago. I don't mean universities going to China, opening huge campuses, making huge cash investments, but maybe partnering with local universities to provide some face-to-face education to combine with some of the online courses that the foreign universities offering, maybe pathway programs, again, given in partnership with local universities. And I'm especially interested with the new legislation in India, for example. I think there's going to be a lot of that happening in India right now. A new form of TNE offering students there different pathways online combined with face-to-face delivery with local partners. I also expect to see more international virtual internships. Again, combining student concerns with employability, especially international students who have invested a lot of money and having huge expectations for employability. You see that they haven't always been met in the past. And now I think in the post-pandemic period, international students and their families will be really looking for that return on investment, especially in terms of employability. That means offering international experiences, not just at international partner universities, but maybe in international business environment, closer cooperation with the industry. So I see an increase in those trends as well. So maybe I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. So we have a lot of focus on a more added value with a different way of thinking, putting the students and the interest and the added value at the center of it, mixing it and linking this internationalization experience with the possibility of employability, with compensation and of the face-to-face differently, and with a mix of ways of doing things. So it's more or less reshaping and going on in a different way with also different goals, because now we are putting additional focus on the added value, and we want to make sure that we are assuring employability through this internationalization. This is one of the things when the private actors like your institutions and other have a lot to do, but I believe the private sector cannot do it alone. They are usually, followed by a lot of institutions. You was just mentioning about what about the accreditations and what about, the criteria, and they will ask us about mobility, percentage of international students. So maybe the government measure should change and might have something to consider in that regard. And I would like to hear from Phil in this regard. Is there any examples of government measure in the context of COVID-19 pandemic to address internationalization and maybe to adjust to this, obliged customization or obliged, shift in the way internationalization is considered from the government and the regulator perspectives?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a really powerful element in terms of government policy, just in terms of broad messaging and sending out the right message that you're open and welcome. And obviously we've been hit by these extraordinary geopolitical rows that I think will really potentially harm or really help certain countries. In terms of poor practice, you had a situation in Australia, for example. The universities are utterly dependent on international students. Often 20-25% of their student body are international. And then you had the Prime Minister in April, really early in the crisis, saying that if international students are struggling or having difficulties in a lockdown campus environment, they should go home. Really sending out these poor messages. Obviously, Australia is getting wrapped up in the sort of Trumpian style geopolitical row with China. So Chinese officials are saying, don't go to Australia. You might meet with racist attitudes. And obviously, you've got Donald Trump, whose behavior during the crisis has been extraordinary, to send out a message to international students of very much that they're not welcome. If they're digital only, they need to get out of the country. They can't study. He's actually increased the barriers for people obtaining visas. So there's some big symbolic measures that have actually, I think, could have really profound long-term effects. It's not just the short-term practicalities. It's actually the messaging, the perceptions. And if you mix a perception that you're not welcoming of international students and then mix that with the pandemic handling that hasn't been particularly good, and we know international students think very, very hard, take safety extremely seriously, there's a real issue there. I think the UK, despite handling coronavirus quite badly, and despite being one of the countries that's managed to have the biggest economic pain and actually let the coronavirus itself drag on in a way that other countries have been much better at curtailing, they have been at least quite positive on the policy side of things. We've had the appointment of a dedicated international education champion. Sir Steve Smith, who was the head of Exeter University, was appointed as a full-time champion of internationalization. And I think it's quite symbolic, but Sir Steve has you know, been a high-profile character in British higher education for a long time, and he will go out and wave the flag and try and build partnerships. They have introduced a new student route within the visa system. British immigration laws are notoriously awful and unwelcoming. They have at least made some concessions to try and make it easier for students to obtain a student visa, despite the fact that there's still some negative rhetoric. I think the ministers are sort of trying to shift the tone of the conversation more towards, you know, if you're talented, we really want you, even though there's this very poor, really unfortunate anti-immigration sentiment underpinning Brexit, underpinning the current government. But at least there's been some positive practical steps to streamline internationalization. And then you've got some really great examples of the coronavirus being handled so well at a national level. The doors are opening for international students in a way that's not possible elsewhere. You know, New Zealand, for example, successfully managed the pandemic. So they're saying actually they believe as early as next month they can start letting some postgraduate students return physically to the country. There seems to be a real optimism that students can get back on airplanes and go back to New Zealand. Canada, again, they've announced international students can come from next week, although their cases are quite still quite high. So it's a question of whether they want to or not. But I think China and Japan are probably the two examples where an extremely cautious approach to the pandemic and very successful handling, combined with incredibly strict border controls, including a very strict governance of international student mobility, has, I think, sent a very powerful message that these countries will bounce back more quickly. And to the point made earlier, absolutely, I think there'll be a new global regionalism. I think there'll be much more mobility within East Asia, for example. It'd be internationalization, but absolutely within regions. We don't need to go from east to west. You know, people won't immediately look to America and Britain as the primary destinations. I think there'll be way more regional mobility based on those regional safety zones. In terms of the regulatory environment, I do think India is the one case where for decades they've said they want to open up to internationalization, and they haven't managed it. They haven't managed to get legislation through. They've talked about whether foreign entities can collaborate and share and build, you know, partnerships on the ground. Finally, this may be happening, and it couldn't happen more quickly. It couldn't be a better time. We absolutely need, if the pandemic has told us anything, it's sharing knowledge, collaborating across borders. Being blind to geopolitics, blind to nationalist agendas is the only way we're going to get through the pandemic. It's the only way we're going to deal with all the other world problems, climate change being perhaps the primary example after the immediacy of this pandemic. So any system like India that is willing to consider changing its regulatory environment to welcome collaboration, increase new partnerships, is going to have, I hope, a really powerful effect. But yeah, for me, the key is rhetoric from the top, openness and welcomingness, showing that through policy change, showing that through the practical steps towards being genuinely welcome rather than just saying you are, and then actually opening up your regulatory systems to be genuinely open to collaborative opportunities. So India is probably the prime example there.
Thank you, Phil. Pleased to hear that there is a example of changes in strategies and in policies governmental level to address, you know, the pandemic impact, and that some of the decision might seem now meaningless or impactless, like a visa restriction. If we look to the internationalization with the virtualization and a global education at home, so having a visa restriction might be, you know, something that became, you know, irrelevant and will not really impact on the numbers and on the result. And maybe this is a good transition to my question to Professor Ainhoa, that we mentioned that there is, you know, a lack to recover. The numbers of international students went down, you know, and we do understand that, you know, you go home, lockdown and other, and this is also an impact on the financial for the institution. And maybe here universities and government should to agree together on a certain number of strategies, process, actions in order to recover the international enrollment rate, even with a different definition, you know, of this international enrollment rate, which might not necessarily imply a physical, you know, shift from one place to another. Any input in that regard, please?
Yes, you are right. Recovering international enrollment rate is very important. And in fact, it is crucial in the case of Spain, because Spain was one of the favored destinations for international mobility. According to the World Economic Forum's Travel and Tourism ranking in 2019, Spain was the most travel-ready nation in the world. And it has been the top destination for Erasmus Plus students for over a decade. It is consistently listed, you know, as the third receiving country for US study abroad students. And the problem is that due to the pandemic, we foresee an average increase in Spanish universities international enrollment of 60% approximately, 60–70%. So taking into consideration this context, you know, for the Spanish university as well as other European and non-European universities, it is very important to address this problem in the short and long term to catch up, you know, international enrollment rate. And I would like to address that in the short term, all universities have tried, of course, to react, you know, to react the emergency, adapting to a new scenario. And there are some emergency plans that seem to be an opportunity for the future. In fact, it's well worth noting that there are 3 best practices that have come up due to COVID-19. The first one is obvious, no? It's a shift in teaching delivery methods. During the pandemic, universities taught online, but now, at least in Spain, most universities have decided for on-site teaching, to go back to on-site experiences and to be on campus. Sometimes basing it on a blended learning system or as a starting attempt while it's possible, you know, and if it's not possible, then they would turn into the online system again. So international students, they have the same instruction models as the Spanish peers, but they have to come to Spain. In the case of my institution, we have tried to allow them, you know, to stay at home or to follow online classes, both in a synchronous and an asynchronous way. And this is very important because we take into consideration the different times, you know, on the different countries where they live. So it has allowed us to maintain international enrollment rate in the present year exactly the same as the last year. So we keep figures in this case. The second best practice it has to do with the special assistance to the international students. It must be said that due to the decrease of international mobility and international applications in most universities, one of the positive aspects is that university staff may assist those students almost on an individual basis. And it may have a very positive impact on the image of the institution and the satisfaction of the students that may bring international students back in the future. For instance, in March 2019, when we had this problem with COVID-19, my university deployed a special service of psychological assistance, and we found every day to our incoming and international students that were locked in Spain and could not go back home. So every day we had to do hundreds of telephone calls, but it was very, very important because it made them feel safer, it made them feel comfortable despite the circumstances. Their family were also, you know, very, very, very happy with this. And the services also provided them medical assistance in case of need, because we also had some cases in which they got sick and they didn't speak Spanish at all. So we were there for helping them and for sending them a doctor that was speaking English, for instance. And last but not the least, you know, in the short term, I think that there is a great opportunity to foster intercultural competences in online communities. And in fact, you know, some universities are focusing on online social experiences for international students. We are working on it, in fact, in order to make them feel part of the community. So we are launching online activities associated with intercultural competences, openness, flexibility, empathy, in order to increase the awareness of others and cultural skills so that we mix national and international students together. But in the long term, universities cannot be on their own. It is very important. If they want to bring international students back or to promote international mobilities of their national students, it's very important the help of public institutions. Both universities and government must cooperate and collaborate in order to reposition national institutions in this new global chessboard. So universities need public support and resources. And what is more important is to ensure more flexibility in legal requirements and processes, both for undergraduate and graduate students in order to obtain visas, to open a bank account, and any other legal requirements. Also, it is very important, you know, that there are extraordinary scholarships programs for international students. It's very useful. And there should also be an increase in public actions to promote our respective countries as quality educational destinations. This is something that we are really concerned, and the Spanish government is trying to work on our, Spanish trademark in a way. So to sum up, international enrollment future as well as international mobility and exchange program is very uncertain. And it may have a great economic and social cost if we are not able to catch up and plan for the future. So this is why we should work together, both public and private sectors.
Thank you, Professor. Still, the private and public sector need to work hand in hand together and need to join efforts, even though we are maybe reimagining and reinventing some of the process and the forms of the international education and internationalization. There is still the classical way, and we need, to promote and to have a trademark that will help the students to come back and to have that international experience complete, because still that the human factors and emerging in different culture and having that contact, whether we admit it or not, we cannot create it 100% in a digital way. We still need some of that, face-to-face. Maybe it will not be 100% program international face-to-face, but it's gonna go in a kind of blended. So, yep, we were saying we feel that some of the decisions might be irrelevant, but we are saying, no, not as irrelevant as that. We are still needing this public support, and we need to reposition this new after COVID international education. Before going to our last question with Giorgio, we have a poll, and we would like to ask our attendees, basically, if we look to the COVID-19 pandemic, do you see it more as a challenge or as an opportunity? And you have, 3 choices: definitely a challenge and an opportunity, or definitely an opportunity. We have been trying to tackle it from different perspectives, from the equality or inequality, from the need of different ways, from reinventing, the definition of internationalization, its impact on research, the need of cooperation between public and private sector, the change of strategies. But at the end, how do you look to it still? Is it a challenge? Is it an opportunity? Or is it both of them? 1 or 2 minutes to take your answer before going to discuss more or less the same with Giorgio. Okay, let us see the result. It's not a surprise, 78%, almost 80% of people see it as a challenge and an opportunity in the same time. It's challenging on some aspect, but it's coming to, disruptive ideas and, change the equilibrium we know. 4% believe that it's more of a challenge, and around 20% think that it's definitely an opportunity, and that the challenging side maybe is put aside and not considered. So we have been hearing from experts from around the world: Turkey, Spain, UK. Giorgio, you have that flexibility through the association, to look at from a more global way. You have surveys and you have members from around the world. So if you can tell us from your perspective, based on the various surveys conducted by your organization, what are the major facts, transformation, and best practices that can be crossed, it can be shared cross universities and cross region in dealing with the pandemic, considering the diversity and the particularity that we may have in some specific environment or some specific cases, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Nabil. So, first of all, let me say something about the facts and the transformation of brought by COVID-19 on internationalization of higher education, but more broadly, I would say on higher education as a whole. Because the first thing we all agree, and we heard it even today during our discussion, that COVID-19 was a major disruption, not only for internationalization, but really was a major disruption on all institutional activities, for all higher education institutions and all over the world. It happened everywhere. Nobody was safe from this disruption, and all levels of universities' activities were touched upon by COVID-19 pandemic. And moreover, we heard it even today again. COVID-19 is not only an health crisis, but is also bringing with it an economic crisis. Other panelists said it more, there will be higher education institution having financial problems, but we don't have to forget that there is also a social crisis. I mean, we heard it about students who were stuck in destination countries, but we heard about psychological support for students because they are in a difficult situation. But at the same time, and this was the outcome of the last poll we even did today, with the crisis is always coming also an opportunity. And COVID-19, I also believe strongly that is at the same time a challenge and an opportunity. So what have we seen happening in the world of higher education because of COVID-19? Probably the most striking point, the most evident one, was an unprecedented shift to online teaching and learning. And this is happening in the international field with more virtual exchange, with collaborative online learning. But this, we saw it also for local students. And something which was absolutely unbelievable, or which was thought a long-term process of shifting towards more online learning, happened somehow overnight. And this was a very positive fact, if you want, because we saw how higher education institution and the higher education sector was responsive and actually completely changed a perception from the external world that sometimes the higher education sector is slow-moving and conservative. Here in this pandemic, the higher education sector demonstrated to be quite agile, actually. However, as every change, it does not come without challenges. And even the shift towards online teaching and learning does not come without challenges. And it's not just a panacea, it's not the perfect solution, because I think we heard it even today, with online teaching and learning comes challenges of access. Not everybody has the same access, so inequality will not disappear overnight. But we will have also issues of inequality, not only of access, but also of capacity. Capacity from student side. Are the students prepared for online teaching and learning? But also capacity from professor side. Are professors able to teach online? Because online teaching is not the same as face-to-face teaching. One of the major topics that was discussed today, there was a very negative impact on student mobility, but at the same time, a great opportunity to refocus internationalization towards more internationalization of the curriculum, internationalization at home. So to look really internationalization, we caters for 100% of the student and not just a tiny minority who are the mobile students that, as you know, they are no more than 2% of the global student population. So we really have an opportunity to make internationalization more inclusive and more equal. At the same time, we have this high risk of growing inequalities between higher education institutions and countries that I mentioned before, especially in research. But we really have to look at the positive, if you want, positive reactions that the higher education community got during this pandemic. And one of the most important for me, two of the most important were, first of all, the great resilience demonstrated by the education community in this time of crisis, and the great innovative spirit. And I will briefly make a short example on that. And the second one, which is also very important, because it was mentioned before, there was a moment before the pandemic when scientific knowledge, when higher education was put on the spotlight, criticized by some parts of the society, by some politicians. We heard in countries, we had enough of experts, this kind of sentences. Nowadays, the pandemic brought to the forefront again the importance of science, the importance of higher education, and really there was a recognition of the real added value of higher education for society. And let me conclude my intervention with some best practice. I would call them more examples, because actually local contexts are very diverse. There is no universal solution, even for the same challenge of, for instance, access to online teaching and learning, because you might have complex completely different local contexts where a solution cannot be completely transferred. However, some ideas, some practice can be interpreted and implemented in a local context. And one of my favorite one, it comes from the University of Campinas in Brazil. And I thank, first of all, the rector, who is one of our member university, Professor Marcelo Knobel, for having told me about this very interesting example. So in Brazil, they realized almost immediately that they had a huge problem of access to internet and laptops. So at a certain moment, they even thought about, we cannot move our teaching online because we don't have the capacity, and we will just teach for very few students, and the majority of our students will not be able to follow our lectures. So it would probably be better to close the university than to go on and teach for only a few people. But then they realized, and they became innovative, that the majority of their students, they had mobile phones. So they started an innovative process inside the institution to try to change the way of teaching, to create content which was useful for to be seen on a mobile phone. And at the same time, they start partnership with telecommunication companies in Brazil to provide easy access to the students. So we see a combination of innovative way inside the institution and opening up of the institution towards the community, and work closely with business and governments. Same example of this collaborative approach, we have it in India on an aspect which was briefly mentioned today, and I would like to conclude on this. As I said, the crisis was not only an academic crisis, it's not only an economic crisis, but it's also a social crisis. So in India, the government and the higher education institution, together with the Association of Indian Universities, they realized that there is a strong need for psychological support to students, and also a strong need to reach out to society and to workers who need to be trained and redeveloped. And there was a coordinated initiative of the Indian government, the higher education community, and the Association of Indian University to provide both psychological support and training for skills for workers. So these are just two examples which might be completely changing different situations, but which are for me very interesting because show, as I said, agility, innovative spirit from the higher education community, and this real need for cooperation. If there is something, and on this I would like to conclude, that the pandemic show, and was mentioned before, we can go beyond the pandemic, we can go beyond the crisis only if we collaborate all together.
Thank you. I would like to pick the word on the agility and the possibility and the need of customizing the solution, and that maybe two minor examples to this. In Lebanon, for example, one of the challenges is that the families do not have as much laptop or tablet as students or as teachers. So one of or some of the universities and colleges, what they did is that they scheduled the teaching hour in different time scale, for the primary, for the year 1, for the year 2, for the year 3, because it's very important that you have twins. I do have, but that we'll have to use the same device at the same time. And that's a kind of customization to allow the families, to offer more equilibrium to the use. In other, Tunisia, for example, they combined the streaming on TV with interactivity through mobile application. So why I'm mentioning this is to pick what you said, Giorgio, is that we need agility and creativity, and we need to think beyond the scope of regular, provider. And that's where I think the pandemic was a good opportunity for the higher education to reposition itself first, because as you said, we recognize the role and the importance of the higher education in such situation, and then to show that even though maybe the big university, then the system is known to be sometimes a mammoth, difficult to move, it showed that with the great research and collaborative work, it has the possibility to go beyond that and to make this pandemic more an opportunity than a challenge. Dr. Nariman, maybe we have a time to pick one or two questions from the QA.
Yes, I think we have a couple of minutes, and worth to say that last panel we spoke about the role of governments and the sort of collaborations that happens not just within the sector but across the sector as well. So those of you who might not have been able to join us, you could access the recording of last panel on our YouTube channel. But I think we have a few minutes for a couple of questions that we could take from the audience.
Sure. I take it one question saying that, all right, if there is this plan A to consider the internationalization at home, our colleague from Jordan said we are very happy to consider it, but to what extent will impact on our ranking and on our evaluation? And if there is an impact, on what way this will be? Maybe Phil, you are the best one to answer, or otherwise it's open to anyone.
Sure. Well, I think it's really important that ranking organizations like my own, that we should bend to the mission of the university and not the other way around. The dog should wag the tail and rather than the tail wagging the dog. So we'd very much be keen to work with universities to say, if you change your strategy, it should not be penalized in rankings. Ranking should just reflect a general overall quality against your own chosen criteria. So it's very important to stress that. We do recognize, I think, this new world does require us to keep revising rankings. On one basis, we've developed new rankings on social impact. They're very much more focused on excellence in achieving the sustainable development goals, for example, across all of them. So good health and well-being, economic growth, all these areas that I think we can all unite together as a global university sector to promote. But I think also we need to understand that where the rankings metrics are starting to become outdated, we should revise them. So actually Times Higher Education's World Rankings has been around since 2004, but we last had a major revision of the methodology in, it was actually 10 years ago, around about 2009-10. So I think we do recognize we're looking at rankings 3.0, they need to be revised. So areas like a faculty-student ratio, for example, it's just less relevant in days of more transnational education, of more digital remote education, for example. Some metrics become more relevant. We reward international collaborative research. It's more highly influential, more highly cited. So those metrics could become boosted. Metrics like your proportion of international students may just not be relevant in the days of, as you say, sort of internationalization at home. So we are basically going through a process now of open consultation on how we adjust rankings. But I'd always say to a university, do what is right by your mission first. Don't worry about the rankings. If you do what is right for your institution that fits your agenda, fits your mission, the ranking should follow you, not the other way around. Don't be driven by rankings, but also more and more rankings are becoming more diverse, more multifaceted. So choose the metrics that are most appropriate to your own mission. But we'd hate to think a university wouldn't act in a way that it wanted to because it might affect the rankings. The rankings will bend to you.
Absolutely. Maybe a last question, and I think maybe Dr. Anwar or Ms. Aisha, one of the attractive factors in internationalization and in mobility is the kind of scholarship given to the students, from various universities, specialties and PhDs. So how would that be continued with after pandemic? And would that be any difference? Would there be some areas or some, fields that will be having more focus because of the nature and their adaptability to the challenges of the future? Or do you think that the pandemic will not really impact on such criteria and parameters?
Professor Yurube, yeah.
I don't have a crystal ball, of course, but I may imagine, that it's going to change, the way we understand traditional scholarships and so on. In fact, for instance, this year we were waiting for a new call by the European Commission that was focused on European universities, and they have decided not to do this call this year to try to redefine, the different, objectives of, for instance, of the European universities alliances and so on. So I think that all of us are redesigning and refocusing, the different strategies at higher education level, and of course scholarships are one of them. For instance, my university had decided to change completely our budget to focus on scholarships and to give more scholarships than we have ever given, and we are also giving 5 licenses of Microsoft to all students, so that everyone has access to our Teams resource, which is the one that we use for teaching, because otherwise we knew that we may have some problems, and some students could be back. So all of us are defining ourselves. Of course, the scholarships will be completely different. And we could even see in the future time scholarships for online students, for instance, which is a broader way of giving everyone the right to study, even if you're at home and you don't go to have an on-campus experience, but at least you have this experience for teaching and learning. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I can also add that my university has increased scholarships for international students at this time. The sort of graduate student funding, I think that's going to rely more on sort of governmental and international sort of research agencies funding availabilities as well, not just institutional level. But probably, I think anything that is related to the cure and the treatment and the vaccination of COVID and other sort of pandemic diseases will be highly, I think, funded nationally and internationally. So for graduate students out there, there were before the pandemic a lot of sort of global challenges facing us all, including the climate change, pandemics, and other sort of epidemics that were regional, but still very, very important. Ebola, for example, in Africa. So, I mean, we have a lot of global challenges, and I think anyone, any researcher, any graduate student working on overcoming those challenges will find it easier to get funding at this point. And I also would like to emphasize, just one of the silver linings in all of this, open science and open research has become sort of more dominant and more accepted all around the world, which I see as a positive development.
Well, thank you very much. Just allow me, before handing the floor to Dr. Nariman, to really thank you all, our panelist member from around the world, for your very insightful discussions and very clear answer. I would like also to thank our more than 70 attendees on this platform who were with us. We had many questions. Unfortunately, for sake of time, we were not able to answer all the questions. But a word to conclude is that, yes, the pandemic was a kind of opportunity. There is a lot of component in the internationalization that are reshaping and rechanging today, but we are pleased to see that there is clear strategies and clear PPP, public and private partnership, in order to shape the new internationalization concept in the after pandemic COVID-19. Thank you very much for all your messages, for your participation. Dr. Nariman, it was really a great pleasure for me. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I won't say more on that. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our chair, our valuable panelists, our audience, those who are watching us also on YouTube and on the Voice of Higher Education. So we're broadcasting on different channels. The link will also be available as of tomorrow morning on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to share it with colleagues that you think may have interest. I also would like to remind you of our next panel on November the 2nd, Monday, same day, same time, and we will be talking about rethinking governance in times of uncertainty. The panel will be chaired by our colleague, Professor Mohammed Zairi, who is an advisor to the Prime Minister's office in the UAE government and an emeritus professor from the University of Bradford. Along with him, there will be 4 panelists. We will have with us Mr. Henry Stover from the Association of Governing Boards in the US. We'll have Dr. Mohammed Lashmi, the president of Ryerson University in Canada, Professor Riyad Hamza, president of the University of Bahrain, and Professor Ahmed Bawa, who's the CEO of the University South Africa Association. So with that, may I wish you a pleasant evening, stay safe, and we hope to see you with us on November the 2nd. Thank you very much. Ma salama.
Thank you very much. Ma salama.